propane.
Great, thank you. I'm going to blame my roster that I have on someone else and not skipping you, Brian, but welcome. Sorry for that. Elaine?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Elaine Prowse, Energy Trust of Oregon.
Thank you. Aaron?
Aaron Childs, Renewable Hydrogen Alliance.
Thank you. This is a little out of order. No, Fred is next.
Hi there, it's Fred Hewitt with the Northwest Energy Coalition.
Thank you, Fred. Ivy?
Morning, guys. I got a lot of meetings happening in the back scene here. This is QB Fabrication and Welding.
Good. It sounded fine, Ivy. Jeff? Jeff, you are on mute, though.
Hey, I'm on again. Jeff Hammerland, semi-retired professor of energy and climate policy at Portland State University, but I still chair the board of our energy certificate program there.
Thanks, Jeff.
Jeff? And Jeff Hammerland, not Jeffrey Roy Hammerland, as I keep getting mentioned in the minutes.
We are so 100% committed to making sure that we have corrected it for today. So I'll just note, Jeff, when we've corrected the summary, we will not make that mistake, Jeff Hammerland.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, Jen Bees.
Morning, everyone. Jen Bees, Director of Environmental at the Port of Portland.
Thank you, Jennifer Jolly.
Good morning, I'm Jennifer Jolly. I'm subbing in as an alternate for Tucker Billman with the co-ops. I represent the Oregon Municipal Electric Utilities, which are also consumer-owned utilities.
Thank you. And Jennifer Hillhart.
Good morning, I'm Jennifer Hillhart, use she, her pronouns, and policy and program director at
Thank you. Jimmy?
Good morning. My name is Jimmy Lindsay, Director of Resource Planning at Portland General Electric.
I don't see Joshua. Joshua, oh yeah, there you are, Joshua. Jump in.
Yep, I'm here. Good morning, all. Joshua Gossett from Climate Solutions.
Thank you. It's Juan Barraza. I don't see Juan. Juan, you out there? Okay, no Juan. Lauren Rosenstein. Okay, Lauren, you're Odo. Why are you on there?
I'm Odo. Skip me, move on.
Yeah, sorry. You know what? I'm making a formal complaint about my roster team. Laura Tabor, is Laura here? Yep.
Yeah, good morning. Laura Tabor, she, her pronouns, Climate Action Director with the Nature Conservancy. Nice to see you all.
Thank you. Mary Merlins. Let's see Mary's name on here. Okay. Nate Hill. Not seeing Nate Hill. Patrick.
Morning, Patrick Mills with the Umatilla Tribes.
Thank you, Patrick. Rebecca Smith. Oh no, Aaron, you're here for Rebecca, right? Rakesh. Rakesh, I can't hear you. You're not muted, but I can't. Try again.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, there you go. Yeah, you need those AirPods in there. Thank you.
That's right. Once again, Rakesh Shaneja. I head electric mobility for Daimler Truck North America.
Right, thank you. Robert Wallace. I see your name on there, Robert. You're out there somewhere. Okay, well, Robert Wallace, I think your name's on there, East Resource Conservation and Development. Sarah Buckwalter, don't see Sarah. Scott Sims.
Yeah, good morning, Scott Sims, Public Power Council. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Shannon.
Good morning, Shannon Souza, Soul Coast Consulting and Design and Oregon Coast Energy Alliance Network.
Right, Tim McMahon.
Tim McMahon with Soul Reeves Law Firm, also representing a number of energy facilities in the FSEC process.
Okay, well, thanks for your patience and grace as we move through the roster. Did I miss anybody? Or did anybody join after we went through the alphabetical order? Okay, awesome. Well, not seeing any, we will move into the approval of our previous meeting summary. So we do have kind of a slide that flashes it, just as a reminder, this, we've committed throughout this process to make sure that we are accurately and effectively capturing the conversations that we're having in this space. And so it is a matter of not just a process, but of importance to ensure that we've gotten it correct. Jeff, we have, I don't know if you can see it in there, we have officially changed the reference, so thank you for just naming it again. Apologies for that oversight. Any changes, edits, comments on the previous meeting summary? Not seeing any. We will then consider it affirmed. So thank you for that approval by lack of edits. So thanks, everybody. We'll do that each and every time. Just again, just making sure that we're capturing what y'all said accurately. So with that, we're going to move into the bulk of our conversation and start with updates on the phase 1 feedback. Edith?
Yeah, thanks, Ben, and nice to see you all and to hear you all saying hello. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to start with update on scenarios in phase 1 feedback. I'm just going to start with this slide that you all have seen before, but just to bring us all to the same place, since it's been a while and it's a new year, and I feel like the holidays often act kind of like an Etch-a-Sketch on our brains, including mine. So this is just a reminder of how the modeling is structured. In the middle, you can see the reference scenario, which we designed based on what we hypothesized would be a least cost pathway to achieve our state's energy and climate goals. And the way that we did this was we included goals or targets for all existing state policies. So that includes HB 2021, the Climate Protection Program, and Executive Order 2004, and aggressive but achievable assumptions on sales shares for electric technologies, for energy efficiency, and for newer technologies such as hydrogen, offshore wind, enhanced geothermal. So we've been using that sort of catchphrase, aggressive but achievable, to help frame up how we structured that reference pathway that meets our energy and climate objectives, and kind of how we framed that up to make sure that we could meet those targets. And into these assumptions went an understanding of technical potentials, feedback from working groups on what's achievable or feasible, and cost estimates from authoritative sources like National Renewable Energy Labs for newer technologies. And we've talked about this before, but I just feel like it's worth repeating. We recognize that achievability will likely require some additional support or some additional policies. And this is precisely why we need an energy strategy in the first place. So the energy strategy is really serving to help understand what it will take to meet our goals and how to get there. So that's a little bit about the reference, but we know that there's no single path forward. And the reference isn't meant to be a forecast. It's meant to be a starting point for the analysis. And to really inform policy conversations, we need to have a sense of direction and of the implications of different choices on overall costs, on affordability, on areas that are of really high interest, like land use, jobs, resilience, and other areas. So to help inform this kind of conversation and this thinking, we designed 6 alternative scenarios where a fundamental piece of the puzzle changes from the reference. And so the key is really what that piece changes and how it affects kind of the whole energy sector and the pathway of how we meet our energy policy objectives. So these have been framed as what-if questions. And then the answers to those alternative scenarios and those what-if questions can be considered as kind of if-then insights. So for example, we have a scenario, what if we don't achieve the levels of transportation electrification set out in the reference? And the way we've done that is by essentially delaying the sales shares that we have in the reference by 10 years. And then, the answer will be, well, if we do that, then what do we see? And that's sort of the exercise that we've undertaken here. So on January 31st, we'll report back on what came out of this whole exercise. And you know, I just want to say that today we're going to talk about where we landed on the reference, on some of the key inputs, and on the alternative scenarios, and sort of some of the adjustments that we had to make, both based on our consultants' recommendations as they were running the model, and also based on feedback that we received. But I think it's really important also just to ground us in kind of the foundation that none of the scenarios are meant to be a forecast or predict the future. Again, this is really to elicit insights that are directional, that are informative. Also, the modeling is not the energy strategy, right? It serves to inform the policy discussions, and the energy strategy will be kind of the modeling results, the insights that came out of the modeling results, and how they informed recommendations and the recommendations themselves. So this is just part of the energy strategy. And once we get into discussing those recommendations, we see those roughly falling into 3 buckets. So we'll get a sense of sort of what it takes to get to where we need to go, what the different options are, which policies are working that perhaps we need to reinforce, where there are gaps, where we might need new policies. And we're likely to also uncover areas requiring further study that we might want to understand a little bit better before really defining a set policy direction. So that's just the quick snapshot reminder of what this exercise is and how we structured it. If we go to the next slide, I'm going to start by talking about some changes that we made to the reference scenario. And these were adjustments that we made, again, kind of as the modeling started, taking into account everything that we've heard, and also hearing back from our consultants what they were seeing and what they were running into as they were running the model. And as you can see here, there are 3 things that I'll touch on. So if we go to the next slide, I'll start with transmission assumptions. So originally we had a list of lines that we put out for public comment, and suggesting that these lines be incorporated directly into the model. So transmission build out is an output of the model, but the suggestion was that we might input some of these lines that are at a certain stage of maturity and certainty. This list included some lines that are not interzonal, and these were removed since the model only has visibility into interzonal connections. So that was one change that happened. And just a reminder, in the model, each state in the West is a zone. The exception is that we split Oregon into 2 zones, East and West, with the Cascades in the middle, and California has a north-south zone. We also tracked developments that were happening on the ground. Let's see. So PacifiCorp is, I'm just looking at the list of lines and what we did. PacifiCorp is projecting part of Gateway West that is interzonal. The latest that we've seen is that line is expected to come on in 2036 at the earliest. So we changed that from being baked into the model because the model essentially allows lines to be built after 2035. And so we just let the model kind of run and see what comes out of the model there. Gateway South came online at the very end of 2024, and we're still confirming. I believe that we still might have had time to build that one in since it came online, but we're still double checking. So I don't have an answer to that one. And then some of these other projects, we're tracking the Cascade project, and we're keeping an eye on BPA's Evolving Grid workshop and announcements. We decided in the end that we would learn the most if we chose to leave these projects out. So the only one that we assumed will be built is Boardman to Hemingway, coming online in 2030. We restricted the model from building any new lines before 2035 to account for the time it takes to build new interzonal lines. Again, this doesn't include intrastate lines. These are interzonal lines. And we let the model determine where lines would be built as an output, but not specifically where, but where between zones. So this is not a transmission planning model. It's a higher level view of the system. And so what we anticipate this will give us a sense of is kind of what the model builds out between zones compares to what's being planned. And that, I think, will be a pretty interesting exercise. And we don't have those results yet, so I can't comment on it but the decision was to not bake in a whole bunch of lines that are kind of in the works, and rather to just because Boardman to Hemingway is very advanced, include that one, and otherwise let the model tell us where it sees the most cost-effective lines coming online. And I should say that we're including both reconductoring and new greenfield. So both of those are outputs from the model. And we'll see what comes out and be able to compare that to projects that are in the works. I'm going to stop here to see if there are any questions on where we landed here, since this is a little bit different than what we originally proposed.
Good, thanks, Edith. And I think you're okay, generally speaking. If folks have questions, just raise your hand kind of during the presentation. But any questions on these assumptions?
And I should say that our team is here in the background too, so I won't be able to take all questions, but the team is here to also help me answer questions, since I don't hold all of this in my head. That's why we have a very smart team here at ODA working on this project.
Yeah, Diane?
Yeah, thanks. I don't know if this is the appropriate place to raise it, but just as we're going through with transmission, how the model might be thinking about market trades and like hurdle rates and things like that, how those pieces are fitting into the modeling. If you could just flag that as you come across them, that would be great.
So it's a good question, Diane. I'll just say that the model optimizes dispatch across the West, so it doesn't account for market friction. It's something that this particular model is unable to do. I will, happy to have a discussion about that on the side and what that means. And there will be, I'll just flag that there will be an opportunity in February to ask some questions with the modeler in the room. So that might be another opportunity to ask questions where I might not be able to give as detailed an answer as Jeremy would be able to.
Right. Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, Diane. Any other questions on this portion? Not seeing any hands, not seeing any questions in the chat either.
Okay, so let's go to the next slide. So the next one is land use. So previously, as we discussed actually in this group, when we were all in person, or most of us were in person, we proposed applying level 1 and level 2 protections from the Power of Place West study and apply them as land use screens. So essentially you couldn't build you couldn't build projects on lands that are included in that level 1 and level 2, which are legally protected lands and administratively protected lands. And we planned to apply level 3, which is kind of the next level of restrictions, high conservation value land, as a screen in a separate scenario where we were restricting resource build. After running the model, our consultant suggested that levels 1 and 2 were not very restrictive in terms of being able to build what needed to be built. And level 3 actually had a pretty low impact as well on what the model could build, essentially still left open a lot of lands for development. And so this is something that I remember, Laura, you mentioned might happen. And so you predicted pretty accurately what we were going to see. And so what we decided to do on land use is to apply level 3, that level 3 land use screen to the reference scenario in the model. And that is really a response to both what our consultant suggested based on what he was seeing, and also a lot of feedback that we received in the working groups and written comments just around land use and the importance of really considering where we build within the state. And so we think that this will produce a stronger basis for the policy discussions, particularly because when we tried to do this in an alternative, we didn't learn very much. And so we just said, well, let's put level 3 high conservation value land as a screen into the reference. So that's the change here. And then I have some follow on in the alternative scenarios on how we addressed it in the alternatives, but I just wanted to point out here the addition of that level 3 high conservation value land screen to the reference node.
Okay, so another pause for questions on the kind of approach, changes, and reasoning for land use.
Okay, let's jump to the next one then, and this is the last update that I have on the reference. So this one relates to carbon capture and storage. Originally, carbon capture and storage was not included as a compliance mechanism to meet our emissions targets. And we received numerous comments about this and confirmed also with our sister agencies the state of existing regulations. And based on that feedback and those conversations, we enabled carbon capture and storage to come in as a compliance mechanism. I want to be really clear, though, that natural climate solutions are not included in our modeling as a compliance mechanism. So in other words, we can capture carbon molecules and pump them into like a storage tank of some sort, a saline aquifer or someplace else, but we cannot credit tree planting, for example, with carbon storage. So a lot of work is underway in the area of natural climate solutions, but it's not advanced enough for us to have included it as a compliance mechanism in the model, but carbon capture and storage is. So I hope that makes sense. And again, happy to answer questions.
Okay, thanks, Edith. Same questions, previous approach, change, reasons for change. Not seeing any hands up. I'm not seeing anything in the chat. Laura.
Yeah, just to clarify, the distinction here is the rationale for not including natural climate solutions, that the evidence base isn't as strong, or just that there's not a protocol for tracking it or something else?
I would say that it's the latter, but I would ask I'd ask Alan whether he wants to clarify any further.
No, I don't really have much to add other than and we try to separate out the sector-based and the emissions and the sector-based and the natural working lands emissions, and they're typically not included.
Does that answer your question, Laura?
I think so. And so it's in part because the natural working lands emissions aren't included in sort of the body of emissions we're modeling in this case. Okay, thanks.
Okay, let's go Corey and then Jennifer.
Just a quick process question for me. I think I heard that these are the fundamental assumption changes from the previous approach to the approach that will be reflected kind of towards the end of the month. And I think what I'm hearing is, you have questions on what we did, which seems understandable here in these slides, but just a quick process question related to that. Do we have questions? Is there some kind of mechanism following this? Or if we kind of take a look in a little more detail around the timing here, is the comment portal still open? Is that the mechanism? I mean, I generally understand what you're saying, but it's complicated stuff, and I'll certainly want to understand.
Yeah, so let me try to answer your question, and you can let me know if I'm not answering what you're looking for. So we had the comment portal open for kind of very specific windows of time, so that we would have time to sort of consider all the comments that we got and choose a direction. What happened then was the modeling started on a very compressed timeline, and there wasn't space on that timeline to go out, seek further public comment, and go back into the model. And oftentimes our consultant would come to us with these suggestions sort of as the model was running and as he was learning things as it was running. So this is why we wanted to be really transparent in this meeting about the changes that we're highlighting, because these were changes that we made based on these conversations we were having with the modeler as the model was being run, that led us to adjust some of these criteria based on both what the modeler was seeing, but also we were going back to what we'd heard in the public comments. And I'll say that for that reason, we were really careful not to. I know that for the reference, for the key assumptions for the reference scenario, we did publish sort of where we landed, but we didn't publish it as final. And for the alternative scenarios, because we had so many questions still up in the air, we had trouble even landing on something that we could publish. So we didn't do that, and we've sort of kept it unresolved until now.
I think the question, though, and correct me if I'm missing this, is if there are additional questions when folks have a little more time to kind of dive in and kind of absorb what's been presented, is the comment portal the mechanism to kind of ask those questions, or should folks reach out directly to Odo staff? Did I get that right?
Frankly, both pieces were helpful. Your
Okay.
question's a good one, Ben, but I appreciate your response too, Edith. I better understand what the ask is here, which is be aware of these changes were made.
Yeah.
And fair enough, Ben, if we still have questions about the changes, where do we direct those?
Yeah.
Sorry. I would say the portal is always open, so that's always a good way to ask questions. We will have an advisory group meeting in February. And I think that kind of leading up to that meeting, if you want to just email us questions to help us prepare for that meeting, I think that might be in this forum the most constructive way to do it. Since that we can then prep Jeremy for any questions that come in ahead of time where you'd like some additional clarification.
That's great. Thanks, Edith. Thanks for
Thank you.
those questions, Corey. Jennifer Jolly?
I just kind of want to get a more basic understanding of what we're talking about. So is the carbon capture that's like from an industrial process, and then the natural climate solutions, the example you gave was tree planting. Are there other, I guess I'm just trying to understand the universe of what these things are.
Yeah. Alan, do you want to further define this, or do you want me to?
Go ahead, Edith, you're on camera.
Okay. I mean, so carbon capture and storage, yes, it's essentially an industrial facility. So it could be production of some sort. It could be, a gas plant where you're capturing the carbon rather than releasing it into the atmosphere and finding some formation, to use a broad term, to capture that carbon. Natural climate solutions are sort of all of the measures that you can take to try to capture carbon, not from a point source, but more generally, and to capture it in, I mean, it doesn't have to be trees. It can be, wetlands or
Okay.
other things.
Yeah,
Okay,
anything, Jennifer, that adds vegetation basically, or trees that can control that can absorb the carbon would be considered sequestration or natural carbon solutions. If you want more detail, if you go to the Oregon Climate Action Commission, OCAC's website, there's a natural working lands fund that was funded by the legislature to the tune of $10 million last session. And we allocated that among 5 different state agencies, and they have very specific detail about what they're doing and the specific capture projects they're doing.
Okay.
So that's a good place.
I just
to
wanted
go.
to make sure I understood. I was surprised to see them together here, but now I'm tracking with you. Thank you.
Sure.
Thanks for those questions, Jennifer.
And I'll just say I put them together here because I think this is a really complicated area, and it's easy for people to assume that kind of the wrong things. I wanted to make a very clear distinction between the two.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that now. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any last questions on the carbon capture and storage? Not seeing any hands, not seeing any questions in the chat. Thanks, Michael, for putting the link to the comment portal. And then Alan, I don't know if you have a reference for the Natural Working Lands website as a resource for folks too. That would be great.
Yeah, I was just looking it up to put it in the chat. I'll put in a definition of natural working lands as well.
Great, thank you, Al. Okay, so I think we're gonna switch to alternative scenarios, Nita.
Okay, great. So there are 3 alternative scenarios here that I'm going to speak to. But I want to start with the next slide, which summarizes all of the alternative scenarios, just so that you have the full picture. So we have slower energy efficiency and building electrification. We have slower transportation electrification as a scenario. We have a scenario that has limited demand response, and this is all compared to the reference. We have a limited utility scale electricity generation in Oregon scenario. And then 5 and 6, you'll notice are new, and I'll get into them in a moment, but we have a high distributed energy resources plus limited transmission scenario. And we have a scenario called no new gas plants, which will also require some explanation. So if we go to the next slide, and I'll just say I'm only focusing on the last 3 from that list, because the first 3 don't have any changes to what we released for public comment we talked to you about back in October. So for limited utility scale generation, I've already actually covered part of the narrative here, which is that we discovered that the way that we planned to limit utility scale generation was not going to be very limiting. And we didn't have a data set that would help us further sort of tighten the land use screens. So we had to rethink this scenario. And if we go to the next slide, what we decided to do was use a different lever to restrict utility scale generation, and essentially build on the results that our consultant was seeing coming out of the reference. So the way that we've now framed this is what happens if we only build half of the generation that the model wants to build in Oregon. So it's a little bit more of a blunt instrument. It's not as directly connected to land use, but you could imagine there being many reasons why less gets built. It could be supply chain issues, it could be difficulty siting, and essentially this helps us answer one of the original key questions that we showed to you back in October of what if utility scale renewable development was delayed. It also helps us respond to suggestions by the consultant that we're finding a lot of in-state build, maybe more than we anticipated, and that also restricting interzonal greenfield transmission and transmission across the Cascades wasn't generating a different enough picture to learn from. And so that's kind of how we landed on framing this scenario this way, where we say we build a lot less than we build in the reference. What does that mean? Where do we get our power from in that case? And how do we meet our energy and climate goals? So I might suggest I'm going to present the next one and then take questions, because there's kind of a link between this scenario and the next one and how we got to the questions we were trying to ask in the first place. So if we go to the next one, essentially the way that we structured that limited utility scale generation scenario, we still weren't getting at a key question, which was what can distributed renewables do for us? What if we build a lot of distributed renewables? How does that change the picture in terms of cost and in terms of what needs to be built and in terms of land use impacts? These are some of the highlights that we've heard from our engagement earlier last year. So we wanted to essentially make sure that we answer the question, what happens if we develop more distributed generation in Oregon? Particularly, we focused on rooftop solar and distributed batteries. So if we go to the next slide, this is where I show some of the details. So the way that we framed this was to take NREL's National Renewable Energy Lab's estimates of technical potential in Oregon. And we said we build out half of that. So we build out half of the technical potential, which is still quite a lot. And then we pair that with batteries. So 40% of those PV systems also have batteries. And we assume that half of those batteries provide flexibility services. And then below you can see what that gives us. It gives us 7 gigawatts, this is by 2050, 7 gigawatts of rooftop solar. It gives us 2.1 gigawatts of behind the meter storage capacity that sugars out to 1.3 gigawatt hours. Transmission, we've limited transmission to only reconductoring, so that somewhat limits imports, but not by very much, because there's so much reconductoring happening and compared to greenfield in the reference. And we also assume 2/3 of cars provide vehicle to grid services. So as part of the high DERs, we also include kind of high demand responsiveness from residential EVs, since those batteries are also a really valuable resource that we thought we'd test. So this is the shape of the new scenario, a little bit like the limited utility scale generation scenario. To get to the question that we were trying to ask, we had to design it a little bit more directly. This is kind of how we came up with it. We took NREL's technical potential and then built off of that. So are there any questions on either the restricted utility scale scenario or the high distributed energy resource scenario?
Yeah, so, Aaron, before we go to you, so Jennifer Jolly, I think if we go, is it slide 17, maybe? We go back to, so the second half of what's in the green, Jennifer, when you say we want to build, the question, are you saying as in a PUC approved integrated resource plan?
Yeah, so it's not that we want to build, it's that the model wants to build. And by that, I mean that essentially the model is searching for the most cost-effective solutions, the least cost solutions. And so it takes into account the costs of building generation, of transmitting that electricity. So transmission costs are included. It takes into account kind of potentials in different places and capacity factor of different technologies, and kind of comes out with a solution in the reference scenario of how much we build in state, how much we import, and when I say how much electricity from different resources, and all those resources are sort of competing. So, solar PV has a different profile than wind, and will have different capacity factors in different parts of the state and region. And so the model essentially gives us a certain amount of resource build out in Oregon. And so it's not at all something that the PUC has approved, because this is not a utility specific model. This is looking across all of Oregon, and and it's looking at demand all across Oregon, and then how we can most cost effectively meet that demand, but not from any individual utility perspective.
Does that answer your question, Jennifer?
Yeah, I think so. I'm just trying to understand. So how, it's not grounded in anything other than what the model says is the demand, I guess.
Yeah, but that demand, that starting point for that demand is grounded in existing data. So existing data, often very Oregon specific, on what do we have in place today? How many, I mean, it's essentially a physical model of all of the demands on the energy system. How many cars do we have? How many trucks? What vintage? What model? What are people heating with? Which technology? Which fuel? What kind of water heater do they have? So all of that, what's energy use in industry, in commercial sector. So the model is built up on the system as we have it today. And then
so historic data.
And
Yeah.
forecasting.
And then
So it's basically a compilation of credible state and regional data, historical and forecasted. For instance, for the data centers, we're using the Northwest Power Planning Conservation Council's forecast for data center load, high, medium, low, and we use the population forecast from PSU for that. So it's a compilation of those data points, as well as forecasts for future growth. So the growth actually comes from the population forecast. That's how we know how many more houses, how many more commercial buildings there are, and things like that.
Okay, thanks for reminding me. This is ringing a bell. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Thanks, Jennifer. So we got a number of questions, hands up. Let's go. Joshua, Ivy, Aaron, Orlowski, and then Aaron Childs. So Joshua.
Yeah, thank you. So kind of a two-part question. The first question is, what is the finding of the model in the reference scenario for utility scale generation? Like, how is it quantified? Is it like acres or megawatts or both? And then the second part of the question is, when you constrained all the way down to 50% for this limited utility scale scenario, was it just a like arbitrary 50%, or were there actually like discrete limited constraints that you put on to get to 50%?
So thanks for the questions, Josh. These are good questions. So we both get an installed capacity in terms of megawatts. And that's for kind of west of the Cascades and east of the Cascades. We get a separate number because we modeled Oregon as 2 zones. But we also checked with our consultant, and he is able to translate that into acres. So we'll have that output too, but it won't say where those acres are within each zone. So that'll be a limitation, but we will get a sense of the overall footprint. And then the 50% is, and Joni, you can jump in and correct me if I'm misstating here, but the way that I was reading it is that it's 50% by technology. So kind of 50% less solar, 50% less wind, 50% less of each of the technologies that are otherwise built in the reference scenario.
Is that good, Josh? Thank you. Ivy?
All right. Hey, good morning, guys. So I guess I'm just still trying to understand here. When you say cost effective, I mean, what is the budget that we should be currently looking at a state then? Because I know that on the BPA side, they have secondary capacity model, the SCM model, and the primary capacity model, which has over $3 billion that they're going to be exceeding in funding to get the transmission line going for all of Northwest. And a huge chunk of that piece will definitely be going into the projects that we're currently looking at too. The Big Eddy one that you guys mentioned that will go online by 2035, it shows that the evolving grid will go by 2032. That should be completed by then. So I don't know how close you guys are kind of intact with a lot of the projects that's evolving in the budget from BPA side, because I think that's a huge component piece when we're talking about being cost effective and actually what the budget we're looking at to actually accommodate these types of renewable energies projects as well, and in combating climate change when we're looking at a specific target date on that too. So I just have some questions on there, and I'm sure you guys already have something formulated on those topics already. And then the last thing too is, I don't know if you guys are already privy to information, but if looking at other states too, because I noticed New Mexico has a transmission authority. It's a renewable energy transmission authority. It's one of the 8 state level transmission authorities in the country. It's called RETA, R-E-T-A, and it focuses on developing new transmission and energy storage projects to promote development of renewable energy resources in New Mexico. So I don't know if we've actually explored those kind of policies to kind of get that in, or even have discussions like that. And that's all I have.
Yeah, a few things there. Jump in.
Yeah, I'm gonna, and Alan, you might want to jump in too, but I'll start with the last piece, which is that we're very aware of these transmission authorities. We've looked at RETA. We've also looked at CETA, the Colorado Energy Transmission Authority, pretty closely, just to understand what's happening there as part of our tracking what's happening in the region. And I think that this is a very good question for the policy working group. So the modeling isn't going to tell us anything about a transmission authority, but it'll provide a foundation for understanding the role of transmission and the relevance and importance of transmission. And that's a good underpinning, I think, to complement other studies that are out there, more transmission specific studies, and to stimulate essentially a discussion about what might be missing if we're not building what needs to be built or not doing what needs to be done. So on the budget question, so this exercise isn't going to come out with kind of a budget of how much we need to spend, because that question is not an easy question really to get at. Everything is compared to what, right? So you can't really say we need to spend this much full stop. It's like, well, we need to spend this much compared to something else, because no matter what, we have a growing electric system, and we're building. And if you look at, you're familiar with various utility plans and IRPs, and there are lots of projects in the pipeline, both transmission and generation. What we are doing is providing a sense of how those costs change depending on what we do. And so that's kind of the value of comparing the reference to the alternative scenarios. And, you know, on transmission, again, what we're going to come out with is, or the model comes out with when we say that it's, you know, pulling out all of these terms are loaded and understood differently by different people. So when we say cost effective, it's not taking into account all the costs and benefits that you could and should consider in deciding what the most beneficial pathway is for Oregon to meet our energy and climate objectives. But what it is doing is comparing the relative costs of providing electrons that we need, clean electrons over time, and cleaner over time, and what can generate those electrons, and what resource mix provides kind of the least cost combination of resources. And when I say resources, it includes not just generation, but transmission is a huge resource. So that's kind of what's coming out of the model, and what we mean when we say that, you know, some people will say it's a least cost model, right? And it is comparing costs across those technologies, but what it's not doing is looking at things like the many benefits that energy efficiency provides that relate to health and indoor air quality and other things. So there are lots of benefits that aren't being included in the modeling, and that's why we're conducting some complementary analysis to get at those.
Thank you, Edith. You know, I know you guys don't have a specific target and budget wise, but I think that if, you know, here as a group, right, we are submitting this report to Governor Kotek on November 1st of this year. And if we look at the months, every month that we have these meetings, and it's going to go by, we're wrapping this up for her about what are the findings and the research and the analysis and the group discussions we're having. We want to be really clear about where this funding is going to be looking like more and be realistic too. And so that way she's really well informed about what are the top priorities. We need to get this going. So that way she can prepare to kind of announce this for the public too. Because it is all the stuff that we're talking about is very costly. Infrastructure is very costly. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, you know, this is part of what the policy discussions are going to really serve the purpose of, because we do have to make some choices, and we have to prioritize, and the focus of the policy discussions will be on the near term, like what's actionable, which actions do we need to take now. And I think that without that, we won't, I don't think it's particularly useful to just point to numbers coming out of a model. What will be most useful will be what those discussions lead to in terms of recommendations and priorities. And where those priorities are, you know, the most powerful message will be where there's some alignment around the state on some of those priorities. Alan, sorry, I think you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to chime in, understand that this is not a transmission model. It's not intended to be a transmission model. It's at a higher level. It's a statewide model with regional zones where we can get imports from, and it assumes no new transmission until 2035, except for that handful of small number of projects that we've identified and talked about. And then after 2035, it includes the cost and also the transmission paths or transmission zone connections, should say, for as we bring on the least cost resources, and depending on which zone they're in. This isn't a location specific model. It's broader than that. So we can't tell exactly where. It doesn't tell us where it is, but we do bring on transmission as needed as it picks those least cost resources in the stack. And I think you know as well as anybody that transmission projects are notorious for being overly optimistic when they come online. You know, B2H is a great example, but so, and then final point, as Edith pointed out, this is not a model that's supposed to tell us how much all of this is going to cost. This is the model so we didn't do a BAU, business as usual scenario and then compare the reference to that, mostly because we don't really know what the business as usual case actually cost. It's certainly not zero, which is what most people think a cost, but doing nothing actually has a huge cost associated with it. We're seeing that with wildfires and other kinds of drought and other kinds of economic disruptions that are occurring. What we're doing here is really just looking at the difference or the delta between the reference case and when we change that get us to our goals. And when we change one or two assumptions in the scenarios that all also get us to our goals, what happens to the cost, what happens to the resource mix, what happens to the emissions? And that's what we're focusing on here, as opposed to looking at it from where we are today compared to a BAU, which is, we don't know what that looks like. And I haven't seen any credible models that actually figure that out either, because it's too complicated. Hopefully that's helpful.
Good, thanks, Alan. Ivy, is you good?
I mean, I'm good. I mean, when I ask questions, these are things that comes up in my mind to kind of make sure that, the group is also kind of, they may be questioning about that too and where we're at. So, I think the biggest thing is that we're basically that hoping you guys are kind of in the weeds and in line with BPA and other major stakeholders too about time frame and how we're, this report is ultimately going to govern a COTEC, so.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've actually met with BPA several times actually and read all the stuff that, including the new stuff that they just put out.
But yeah, it's a good
thinking.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Good call out, Ivy. Aaron Olowski.
Hi, thank you. I was wondering if you could talk a bit about the factors that NREL used in their technical potential assessment. How did they arrive at that number? I know obviously that's not that's not a study that you did, but maybe if you could describe how they arrived at their technical potential assessment, since the source of that has a big impact on that scenario. And then maybe when you're talking about that, if you could kind of give us like a picture or a qualitative sense of what that looks like. Are they assuming basically a solar panel on every single roof in the state, or what does that look like on the ground?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. I can't answer your question. We can get back to you and check with our consultants on the weeds of what's behind NREL's numbers. I know that they chose NREL because they think NREL did a good job. But I don't have an answer for your questions, but we can get back to you.
Yeah, we'll get back to you, Aaron, but the short of that very long story to answer your question is that we use NREL because they're unbiased, they're science-based, they're a credible resource as compared to, say, for instance, developer cost projections and things which are notoriously overly optimistic as well. They put together resource-specific cost and potential curves, and it's based on the potential for every one of these renewable resources. When we're talking about renewables, so they look at the different areas, what's the potential for them. They've developed these, you've probably seen the wind maps and the geothermal maps and the solar maps about where the potential is around the Oregon and around the region. They incorporate that into what's potentially available and what's cost effective in term, what the cost is of each of those kinds of resources, depending on where they end up being. And that's the data that we're pulling into this model. And Jeremy can answer that more of a detail.
Yeah, what I'm hearing is that some sort of pricing factor is included in the technical potential, not just engineering technical potential, because there's a big difference.
What do you mean by pricing?
Like, is it, the technical, I'm by no means an expert on this, but I'm wondering if it's, is it calculated based on how much sunshine hits the state and how much roof space there is? Or is it calculated based on that plus how much it would cost and how much the cost would affect developers to, okay.
The latter, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the follow-up. Jimmy and then Aaron Childs.
Thank you. Yeah, I think this is the slide that was generating my question, 17 here.
And just the first bullet, you know, I think is expressing the observation that in-state generation is sort of, you know, avoiding the need for some quantity of transmission. And I'm just wanted to be reminded and sort of scrutinize how you all are sort of evaluating in-state transmission assets. Like a number of the transmission infrastructure are all like intrastate, including Bethel Round Butte and Getty Shamawa. Like, am I right to recall that those pieces of infrastructure that you're now allowing the model to select, as opposed to assuming exist, are allowing for greater delivery of, you know, power generation delivery across the Cascades? Or I was hoping you could kind of remind me of how that works, given this first bullet point.
I'll start and then I might see whether Joni or Alan or somebody wants to add anything. So in terms of the outputs that we see, we only see interzonal transmission and changes in interzonal transmission. Anything within the state, I mean, essentially the model does calculate the cost of a need for transmission and distribution. But we wouldn't see that as an output. I don't know if that makes sense, but essentially the only level that we see is that interzonal level. But you can assume that a lot of those lines that are needed in the state are built. Won't have that level of granularity in the results to be able to point to it. And part of that is that this is not a transmission planning model, and the more specific we get, the less useful those outputs become.
But is the zone, I think you said it earlier, the zones differentiate between like the east side of the state and the west side of the state?
Oh yeah, they do. So we will have a figure for both reconductoring and greenfield new build across the Cascades, and any line that we didn't bake in as an input, it doesn't mean that we don't think that line is going to get built. It just means that we let the model show us what it suggests would need to be built.
Okay.
Yeah, keep going, Jimmy. Yeah.
Just to kind of close, just to sort of thank you, and so it's right to understand that the first bullet could also says or means that some in-state generation actually does require transmission to get from zone A to zone B. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be reasonable. Joni, do you want to jump in here?
I think two things, Jimmy. So what Edith was saying, in terms of the model selecting what's cost effective, anything in state includes a proxy cost for like the GenTie that it would need to build a new resource in a zone. If you're building a resource in a different zone, it will include in that selection part of the cost to get it. So when a new line comes online, either from reconductoring or something else, that enables more flow. But it's, as Edith said, that's part of, I think, the model's logic of how it selects. It's not necessarily going to be clear, but it's something to help understand. When it says cost effective, it does include it's cost effective considering that proxy cost. Does that help?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity for the Q&A.
Yeah, and Jimmy, I'm seeing now that Joni was speaking and I had a moment to just meditate on the first bullet, I can see how this could be a concerning way to frame it. So we might reframe this when we present the final model results, because we don't want to say that the model recognizes, and we recognize, that when you're building more in state, you need more capacity on lines to move those electrons around. And I think that's what's jumping out at you. So I appreciate the observation on that point.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jimmy. Let's go to Aaron Childs.
Thanks, folks, and appreciate the good discussion here. I think maybe what I'd flag most broadly is that I think it's hard for us as advisory group members to engage on some of these reference scenario or these scenarios that are specifically designed to provide a counterpoint to the reference scenario when we haven't seen results and findings on the reference scenario. So I think we can assume, right, based on this, that the reference scenario is producing a lot of in-state resources, that is a relatively cost-effective approach, and we're trying to explore what happens if that's not the direction that the state goes, right? Whether that's we need to look outside of our region, we need to look at DERs. We saw that on the previous slide that the hydrogen scenario is maybe been changed to a more turbine focused scenario. And I assume that's also being driven by some of the initial findings out of the reference scenario. I would just say it's, as advisory group members, I think you're starting to hear from us that we have a lot of questions about what's coming out of the reference scenario and how these scenarios will be testing what I think you all are already seeing out of that process. But until we're able to sort of see the way that these scenarios are testing different futures, right? And what future the reference scenario is producing without these additional constraints, it's really, really hard for us to say whether or not these are helping us to test realistic scenarios for, technology and energy infrastructure deployed in Oregon. So I think at least from an RHA perspective, we appreciate this work, but I think, until we get those numbers, it's pretty tough here.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. And I'll just really encourage everyone here to listen in or come in person if you can to that January 31st meeting. And this is also why we are bringing Jeremy into our February advisory group meeting, because we wanted to be upfront about these changes so that on the 31st, you're not surprised by like, wait, where did this scenario come from? So we're giving as much background as we can today, but we haven't seen the final model results yet. Everything's being finalized right now. So appreciate the comment and also you all working with us with the information that we have at the moment. And also, sorry.
What were you gonna say, Edith?
I was just gonna say that, Aaron, that's a perfect segue into the next scenario.
It is, and so as we're doing that, let's if we can just remind folks, it should, hopefully it's in look at Michael, good job. So let's keep going, and Michael just put the information as a reminder for folks around the meeting at OMSI on Friday, the 31st, which will be there's lots of room at OMSI, so please join in person if you can. All right, let's keep
Please
going.
invite- Yeah, please invite people too. We reserved a large space so that we could accommodate anybody who wanted to be there. So we're not worried about overfilling the room. Okay, if we go to the next slide. So here's the last one that I want to talk about, which is a scenario that we've named No New Gas Plants, which requires some explanation. So originally, this was what we proposed as a high hydrogen scenario that we had proposed framing as what if hydrogen was available sooner. And based on comments we received and discussions with our consultants, we felt that there was a lot of risk that accelerating hydrogen availability and moving it up to 2030 and moving up the delivery infrastructure to 2030 might be overly ambitious and might also not be the most instructive scenario. So one of the things that we did throughout this process was to try to kind of to lean on our consultants really to help us understand where we're likely to learn something helpful. If there isn't much of a change, it's not very helpful to us, doesn't do anything to inform the policy discussions. So we explored a number of other options, and you'll remember in our last meeting, we still hadn't landed. We explored a lot of other options. We looked at early phase out of the IRA production tax credit. We looked at delayed hydrogen availability. We looked at potentially delaying clean fuels across the board, kind of hydrogen and biofuels. We explored a number of pathways and checked in with our consultants on what we might expect to come out of the model. And in the end, what was coming out that was most interesting from the model and most instructive from a policy perspective was this very essential role, reliability role that clean fuels play for the power sector. So what we were finding is that there's, I mean, this is all kind of peeking under the hood before the modeling is done, but we saw that there were many small clean gas plants that the model wanted to build. So they're 100% clean, and they're burning some combination of hydrogen and biogas in Oregon. This is in addition to, I should step back and say that there is a little bit of fossil gas left on the system that's providing a balancing resource to the system in kind of non-HB 2021 customer territories. But we have these other clean plants that are running at very low capacity factors, but are a critical reliability resource. So essentially, it's a bunch of plants that sit around most of the time. And then when there's a confluence of challenges on the system, low hydro season, low renewables output, extreme weather, they turn on and provide critical energy for the system. And so we thought that it's a really interesting finding. It's something that we didn't have cost results, but you could imagine there being some questions around paying money to have something sit around and then burn expensive clean fuels. Rarely, but importantly, I would say, to maintain the reliability on the system. And so we just wanted to understand the finding a little bit more clearly. So if we go to the next slide, the question that we decided to ask was, what happens if these plants that play a reliability role don't get built? And essentially, this is a question about how in a high renewables future do we maintain a reliable power system? And also recognizing that there's competition for these really valuable clean fuels across the energy system, not just for the power system. So kind of exploring that angle too. And so the way that we framed this is, as I just mentioned, we see some existing fossil plants providing a balancing role outside of the HB 2021 customer base. And we didn't mess with those, so those remain on the system. But we said that new combustion turbines running on 100% clean gas don't get built. We just took them out of the model. And this is meant to help us understand pathways to ensuring reliability in that high distributed renewables future, particularly when things get tight. And this is a question that you hear kind of across the board in discussions about how do we decarbonize and how do we keep the system reliable. And it kind of opens the door to explore the role of different technologies, like what steps in, how does it step in, what does that cost, and really just to inform policy discussions. So we're not predicting that these small plants will get built or that the alternative scenario is the way that we'll go. But it is really interesting to see that the system is really reaching for something to provide that reliability resource. It's very infrequent because we have a lot of flexibility on the system already. We have a lot of hydro on our system, and that provides a degree of flexibility. But there's still something missing that we need when we get out towards 2050. And so the focus of the scenario still is on the role of clean fuels and really hydrogen and biogas, but it tests out this more narrow question that our consultants advised turns out to be really critical when we look at what we need on the system going out to 2050. And I don't know, Jillian, if you want to add anything, or if we should just go directly to, I see Aaron's hand is up. I don't know if anybody else has a question about this one.
No, Edith, I think you covered it, so we can hear Aaron's question.
Good, thanks. So we'll go, well, actually, it's Aaron Childs first, then Joshua, then Aaron Olowski. You're on mute though, Aaron Childs. I can see you working through the process.
I was gonna say I got the camera, but not the mute. Thanks, Edith, for talking us through this. I know Joshua's flagged some questions about sort of compliance with existing law and sort of how this lines up. I think, we would be very interested to understand sort of what assumptions are going in behind the hydrogen and biogas supply, as well as hydrogen and biogas delivery. Most of these turbines have relatively substantial offtake needs, and just making sure we're sort of clear on some of those pieces would be helpful. But I think from sort of a broader electric sector planning and balancing standpoint, hydrogen turbines often get used as a proxy resource for long duration energy storage assets with dispatch capabilities over 100 hours, which oftentimes aren't modeled through other long duration storage or lithium ion technologies. And that's, fine. But I think there is growing consensus amongst the energy planning community, electric sector planning community, that is really hard to get to full decarbonization without assets that offer those long-term balancing resources. And so if we are removing hydrogen as our proxy resource for that electric sector balancing, it would be helpful to understand what other resources Odo expects to be filling the gap for seasonal balancing, whether that's demand response programs, whether that's other storage resources, et cetera, because what we're doing right now is essentially removing a tool from the toolkit that is designed to address a specific point source electric sector challenge without necessarily offering any new tools. And since we are focused on 2050 goals, we have a relatively long runway for technology advancement and development. And so it would be helpful for us to understand so sort of how we're getting to that last 5 to 10% of the electric sector decarbonization and how this approach fits in.
Yeah, thanks. So I'll say that I'm gonna let Jillian answer most of this question, but I just want to make the point that we're not taking out hydrogen when we're taking out one option for reliability in the power system and then seeing what other tools step in to provide that. But that hydrogen, hydrogen is competing between different sectors. And so if it's not going to these power plants, then it's still available elsewhere. And I just want to, I also see Joshua's comment. I just want to say that these are plants under 25 megawatts. And that's why they're compliant with HB 2021 and why there are many of them, because they're, we put restrictions on to keep things HB 2021 compliant. And then what ended up happening was we ended up with a bunch of these under 25 megawatt clean fuel burning combustion turbines, essentially.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. So I would say then, there's some electric sector questions, and I hope the smart electric sector folks are going to chime in and weigh in on this. But I think, the other flag that you're raising, Edith, is the fact that, there is concern that we may have, limited availability of clean fuels, and that use of the clean fuels in turbines may limit availability for other end use applications. And if there are considerations there around supply constraints that would be impacting pricing for the overall market or availability for the overall market, including for transportation or industrial sector applications, that hasn't really been something that we understood the model could compare, given the endogenous versus exogenous assumptions. So if we are trying to get some trade-offs there, I think that would be helpful to be pretty clear about what constraints and trade-offs we're trying to model with this scenario.
Aaron, when we get to recommendations on the research bucket, remember that one. That's a great one. But I will say that one of the things that our model does, because it's economy wide and it goes beyond just the electricity sector, when the electricity modeling was done a couple of years back, they said that the last 2-3% of meeting the greenhouse gas emission reduction goals was really, really expensive, because they were basically adding in new renewables to meet all that. And so they had to do like 3, 4, 5 times as much because of capacity factors and other kinds of reliability issues. But what this model does, because it's economy wide, it's able to take resources from the renewable clean biogas sector and put that into the turbines and have it run. And that's much more cost effective than buying 3 times as much or 4 times as much solar to meet that same need.
That's helpful, Alan. And is this, just to be clear, are these turbines exclusively buying biogas resources, or are they also looking to buy electrolytic hydrogen, and is that factored into electric sector modeling?
Good question. Edith, do you know the answer to that?
Jillian?
And then, sorry, yeah, maybe Jillian, you want to answer this?
I mean, I'm not sure I understand the question. I think the gas plants that do show up in the reference case before we take them away to test in the alternative are either exclusively biogas or exclusively clean hydrogen, and the two are competing. So whatever shows up is kind of what wins out in that economic test.
Yeah, it's a least cost model, so pick the lower
Okay.
cost.
And I guess the specific question here is when we are using hydrogen, is the assumption that it is produced electrolytically, and if so, are we accounting for the additional renewable resources we need to produce that electrolytic hydrogen?
Yes, I believe yes. It's not a requirement that any hydrogen produced is electrolytic hydrogen. That is really determined by our other constraints, our emissions constraints, but other technologies are available for the model to choose, whether that's methane pyrolysis or SMR with carbon capture. And so it's not a rule in the model, but that's what we're likely to see.
Okay, and we are seeing the incremental load associated with producing that hydrogen and the
Yes.
whatever balancing. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you, Jillian. Okay, I'll get out of folks' way. Thank you.
Thanks, I appreciate that. Let's Joshua, and hopefully your question in the chat was responded to, but add to that, but let's go Joshua, Aaron Olowski, and then Scott.
Yeah, thanks. I actually have a new question now.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
So yeah, I understand the value of exploring the scenario, particularly from sort of the perspective of sort of like, recommissioning stranded assets. There's lots of gas plants out there that are shutting down, and I know that folks have already been looking at how to put sort of like hydrogen turbines into new gas plants. My point in the chat about that these resources, these generating resources, would not be considered clean under HB 2021. Definition of clean under HB 2021 is a generating resource that doesn't emit into the atmosphere. But Edith, your point about, I'm not sure what the 25 megawatt threshold is. Are you referencing FSEC rules, or are you referencing the statute, or where's that from?
Joni, I'm gonna let you take this one unless you want me to start, but
Yeah. I don't have it up, Joshua, but the House Bill 2021 constraint on siting new gas in Oregon sets 25 megawatts is the limit for that. So that's where that's pulled from.
Okay, yeah, so that's an FSEC rule. But my original point is that these generating resources would not be compliant with HB 2021 with the statutory targets in the law. So that's just my point. Thanks.
Joshua, can you elaborate on why hydrogen would not be compliant? It is not emitting
I
at the
believe
source.
that when hydrogen is combusted, it does have emissions. If I'm not
It does not have carbon emissions when hydrogen is combusted. If right now, there are no 100% hydrogen turbines, and so you need a certain amount of natural gas to start up a hydrogen turbine. But that is not likely to carry into the future. There will be 100% hydrogen turbines. And so, that hydrogen specifically would not emit carbon emissions.
right. It
Biogas
would
obviously
have other
does.
emissions though, like NOx, right?
It does emit NOx. Yeah, there are
Okay,
other
so
emissions, but isn't
yeah, point well taken. I think I'd have to look at the statute. Maybe others are.
There's also another really important part of that, Joshua, is that HB 2021 only applies to the investor-owned utilities, not the public utilities.
Right.
So not all utilities need to are regulated under that rule. So these could be public utility ones, for instance.
That's true. Yeah.
So the model doesn't.
Yeah, that's true, Alan. I would just like to, as we kind of like get into the policy discussion later, I think that just understanding those parameters is important of, what would be compliant with HB 2021, what wouldn't.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right, which is, and the IOUs are roughly 75% of the load in the state, roughly.
Well, let's.
And I'll I'll just
Bonnie.
add really quickly, Joshua, I think your point's well taken. I think we definitely do need some clarity around HB 2021 and what types of facilities could be cited. And so that is absolutely something that should come up in the policy conversations.
That's great. Well, then let's, yeah, we'll capture that in the notes, Joshua, and I know you and others won't forget as we get into those policy conversations to, seek that type of alignment and discussion. Aaron Olowski, then,
Before we
Alan.
move on, I just wanted to make clear that the model doesn't take every single law because in Oregon and say we're applying it, because that book is literally 1 inch thick just for energy laws. But it does, the modeler and Jeremy did was make sure that all of the by backcasting all of the major all the rules and laws and regulations in the state are being complied with. So it does take into consideration all those laws and rules when it was building and doing the modeling.
Right. So there's a component for modeling, and then there's a component in conversation around the policy application in the future. So Aaron, let's go to you, then Scott, then Jeff.
Thank you. Yeah, I think actually you touched on the answer to the question I was going to ask, which was to get a bit more information as a refresher on who the outside the HB 2021 customer base is. But you all kind of touched on that in a couple different spots. So,
Did you want to add anything else, Alan, or others around the customer base? Okay, you good, Aaron?
yes, thank you.
Okay, Scott.
Yeah, thanks so much. It's been a great conversation. I just want to make sure to circle back and understand fully what we're talking about here in terms of the fuel source. Are we saying that there would be no natural gas optionality as we're working toward biogas or hydrogen sourcing? The reason I ask is that I think I've said this before, but it's worth repeating that for our policy discussions and for the R&D aspect going forward, the California model offers a terrific example. I mean, they've been leaders in renewables development and trying to wean themselves off of fossil fuel emissions. But they also have built a state emergency resource. I'm not going to term it right, but it's essentially a contingency resource that has natural gas, plants that are essentially hydrogen ready, biofuel ready, et cetera. They've also been, amping up the amount of batteries, et cetera. I just think that we have an opportunity to not have to recreate the wheel. There's been a lot of great practical example that's happened in that territory of California that I think we really should examine, not only what the intent was on the outset and the deployment, and then what ultimately has happened or transpired since, which has included, I think, some reliance on natural gas as a bridge fuel, but again, using that very seldomly and very selectively. So again, I just think that there's somebody else right next door who's got incredible experience here that we can perhaps fast track forward and take the best of the best from them and the learning examples. So really encourage this group to look at that. I think all sources across the country continue to say that natural gas, will be a bridge fuel for some time, especially as we're encountering these, unprecedented events. And I'm really glad to see that on the slide here, the extreme weather, low renewables output, certainly low hydro. I mean, we come from a hydro-rich region, but we can't kid ourselves if we tell ourselves that we're not going to have periods of drought or some potential impacts from climate change. So really want to make sure we don't lose line of that point as we go forward, and then how we might have to legislatively adjust if we do need to use a little bit of that natural gas. Thanks very much.
So it sounds like mostly a comment. Joni, did you want to reflect back? I mean, I think it's a good it's preparing us for some of the resources that might be references as this group has policy conversations. Joni, anything to add or reflect back?
Yeah, I think I heard maybe a question at the start there, Scott, but you raised a lot of really great points for us to carry forward into the policy discussions. I think one thing that might be clear on the slide is House Bill 2021's emissions constraints apply to a portion of the electricity system, and those are incorporated in the model. We have also incorporated the executive order, so the model selects beyond that to try to narrow it down. And what we see is Edith was talking about is, or what I understand from the modeler, as the electricity system's emissions go down, it does start to rely on these small, clean gas burning turbines to provide that reliability. But I think the resources you pointed to will be part of the policy discussions. So thank you for sharing those.
Scott, you're on mute. I can see you ready responding.
Sorry, thank you for that. An excellent point, Joni. And just to also do a crosstab, we had the transmission case study earlier. Is there a crosstabbing of potentially deployment of these small natural gas units in potentially transmission constrained areas so that you would potentially get the mutual benefit of not only the supply side constraint, but also the transmission constraint? So, essentially laying over a map of potential constraint areas for transmission, especially in times of low renewables output or extreme weather, and then sort of co-optimizing the location of those natural gas facilities to provide resource commitments to both the transmission and the power side, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I can start. Edith, I don't know if you have more to add, but just as we were talking about transmission earlier, this is I'd say the model solves for reliability, but it is at a high level given all the efficiencies in the model. So I think that level of resiliency is also something we're looking forward to discussing more in the policy groups. But yeah, there's we modeled Oregon as 2 zones. There's certainly transmission constraints beyond that are
That was a big giant thumbs up. That was wild. Well, thank you, Scott. Thanks, Johnny. Jeff, jump in.
Okay, thank you. So my question actually overlaps a bit with Scott's. So, but I'll just try to make it more broad, more general. I'm hearing this has been a very helpful discussion, so thank you all very much. I'm hearing that the model will always try to look at the most cost-effective option, which certainly makes sense, and it's competing various options as you go along. I'm wondering where resilience and diversity and protecting the system from wildfires and earthquakes and so on fits in. Does that happen later at the policy phase where we add those considerations, or is that considered in some way, shape, or form at this modeling stage? Because cost effectiveness is obviously very important, but it's not the only criteria we need to consider.
Jeff, it's a really good question. I think Joni answered half of it by explaining that the model does kind of solve for reliability, and there's an element of resilience there. But to your deeper point, there's only so much that the model can tell us on resilience. But I will say that a lot of the model outputs set us up for a robust discussion on resilience, because there are certain tools that we know are important and can help support community energy resilience. There was no way in this model to kind of put our thumbs on the scale for that. But for example, in the high DER scenario, we know that a lot of these distributed energy resources can also provide a resilience value if you have PV plus a battery, for example. I know that there's a lot of talk about microgrids. We didn't model that, but we will provide some figures on, what the model is coming out saying this is pretty cost effective stuff, or maybe it's a bit more expensive, but that's maybe something is more expensive. I'll just leave it general, maybe, but if there's a resilience benefit, it's worth pulling into that policy discussion and saying, okay, it's not just system-wide cost we care about here. We care about resilience. How can we make this happen? What's missing? So the idea is to have a really robust discussion in the policy working groups, but it does end up being there rather than here where we're presenting model results.
Thank you.
Thanks. Well, I pause. I wonder if there's any more questions on this. Maybe Edith, we can kind of do the one more slide and then take a break and then come into the next part of the agenda. Any other questions here? That was great, the conversation, y'all. Okay, not seeing any more hands. So Edith, do you want to hit the kind of final sensitivities? Then we'll take a break and move into the next pieces.
Yep. Yeah. So this is a great discussion, so appreciate everybody's comments. So here's one more that might generate some discussion. So we had a couple of sensitivities that we planned to run, and there's no change in one. So in the reference scenario, we include the 20% statewide reduction in VMT by 2050 goal that our state has, average across the state. And we are applying that sensitivity in both the reference scenario and in that high distributed energy resources scenario. The second sensitivity that we planned to incorporate was to restrict east-west transmission across the Cascades. And our consultant came back to us and said, you know, because there's so much reconductoring happening, and the way that that constraint was framed, it was greenfield transmission constraint, like we don't get any new greenfield transmission, but reconductoring can happen. There were limited learnings coming out of that scenario, and we didn't want to spend our budget on a scenario that has limited learnings. And so we replaced it with a scenario that looks a little bit more deeply at data center growth, which is, as we all know, a really big topic right now. So in the reference scenario, we applied the Northwest Power Conservation Council's mid to high forecast for data centers to 2030. So like the higher one that they provided a few months ago. And then after 2030, we applied a 1.5% annual increase in data center loads for the rest of the time out to 2050. We get into pretty uncertain territory the further out in time we get, but there's so much concern over the amount of load that comes on with data centers that we wanted to continue to project that out into the future. In this sensitivity, we explore what happens if only half of those data centers get built. What does that mean in terms of kind of the overall size of the system? And we felt that this would be a really important sensitivity to explore, because it sort of digs into it helps us create a bit of a bookend so that we can have a more robust conversation about the role of data centers and data center load growth on the state. So that's where we've landed on the second sensitivity, and ready to take questions that people might have about it.
All right. Thanks, Edith. Yeah, Jimmy?
Edith, sorry if I wasn't listening closely. Would you mind just repeating the third bullet point and making that a bit, I don't quite understand the third bullet point.
Yeah, so the third bullet is it explains that the sensitivity of 50% lower data center growth replaces a previous sensitivity that we were planning to run and that we budgeted for. So that previous sensitivity was a constraint on transmission between Oregon East and Oregon West, between the zones, essentially transmission across the Cascades. Our consultant came back to us and explained that most of the growth in transmission capacity across the Cascades that the model is coming up with is reconductoring. And there's much more reconductoring happening than new greenfield transmission. And so when he put this constraint on, he said, it's not generating results that are particularly helpful for policy discussions because they're not that different. I don't know, Joni, if you want to add anything to what I've just said, but that was the kind of the reasoning. But so that third bullet is just kind of explain that we replaced that constraint with that sensitivity with this new sensitivity.
I apologize, Edith. I was reading through the chat. But Jimmy did. Any follow-up question, Jimmy, based on what Edith just said?
I think I understand. Is it right that there used to be a sensitivity that you're no longer planning to do?
Yes.
That placed a constraint between East and West, and you found that sensitivity, doing some initial analysis, wasn't producing any meaningful results.
That's right.
That's right.
And if you all, I know we've been kind of referring several times to kind of these interim results that are changing the study design. Apologies if I wasn't tracking close enough in the holiday. Is that stuff that you've sort of circulated at all, or has it sort of remained an internal work product that you're all responding to?
it's internal. This has been happening on a very condensed timeline. So we've been having to just, I mean, we've been learning a lot every week as the modeling has been happening, and it's all been partial results. As you were kind of saying, Jimmy, that it's like you get a preliminary sense of things, but before you have all the information. And so it's been between us and the consultants.
Thanks for that question, Jimmy. Laura?
Yeah, just one quick question. I feel like Edith, you've used the phrase a lot of reconductoring happening a few times. And I just want to clarify, is that the model is selecting a lot of reconductoring, or that's an input of, we know that reconductoring is starting to happen in a lot of utility planning? Both.
It's that the model is selecting a lot of reconductoring as a cost-effective option.
Thanks for that clarification, Laura. I'm not seeing any hands. We're at 10:50, so maybe a little bit behind where we thought we might be at this point. Are folks good? Let's take 10 and come back at 11. Or take 9, I guess. Okay. Let's take 9 and we'll be back at 11. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to finish my last couple chews of my Cheez-Its. For those that know how much I enjoy a small square cheese cracker. So welcome back. We're at 11 o'clock. Thanks for rejoining. I've caught up in the chat. So thank you for folks engaging in that way. Edith, let's keep going. So we're moving from sensitivities into the next part of our conversation.
Yeah, let's do it. Okay, so the last point that I want to make about all of this information that we're sharing with you today is just to summarize more broadly how we're wrapping up phase 1 as we get into phase 2. So again, phase 1 is all of the work leading up to and through the modeling. So you could say January 31st is kind of the end of phase 1 where we present those model results. Phase 2 will be the policy discussions. So we have been working to summarize all of the feedback that we received in phase 1, the key assumptions that we used, and the sources that informed those assumptions, and also a technical approach. So those are kind of the 3 pieces here, and I'll just walk through them one by one. So the comment response document pulls together about 400 comments that we received through public meetings and in writing, and provides a response to each comment. So the comments are grouped together where they're similar, where they're kind of asking the same question or making the same point. So there is a little bit of a roll up happening in there, but it's still a pretty detailed document, but also structured in a way that should be really user friendly. So if you made a comment or anyone made a comment in a particular working group, it should be pretty easy to find kind of the subject and where your comment lives and how we responded to it. So that's kind of the comment response document, and that's really the place where we reflect back what we heard and what we did with it. This second bullet, the final scenarios, assumptions, and sources. So this is really a document that describes much of what we discussed today. So it talks about where we landed on the scenarios, on the key assumptions, where there were changes. We track those and reflect those changes. And we'll also include the sources behind the key assumptions that we made. So all of that will be in one place. And part of the reason that we're working really hard to prepare this now is that we think that it'll be really helpful in the working groups when questions come up around why a certain assumption was made and how that's similar or different to what somebody else is seeing. It just provides a pretty solid foundation for those discussions, and also a reference point to point back to and to review. And then finally, we thought that it would be valuable to publish the final technical approach. So essentially, when we started this whole project, our consultants included a technical approach really in their initial proposal. to do this work, to undertake this work. And since then, it's been adapted based on feedback that we've received. So the original technical approach isn't the same as the one that we have today because we've incorporated a lot of new data sources. We've heard feedback on how we structure the analysis. And so we've asked our consultants to update that technical approach and to to essentially pull together a technical approach that we can publish that also just serves as a resource to folks and describes what was done and how it was done. And I just want to point out, kind of following on these three pieces. So these three are kind of discrete files that we will publish on the website and that will be available to anyone to look at. And we're working on getting these ready as soon as possible, but I hesitate to give a date since there's a lot going on right now all at once. But certainly we want these to inform the policy discussions. So we're trying to get them out as soon as possible. I also want to just point out, really hearkening back to our August meeting, that we're not yet drafting the final report and we've not lost the comment that several of you made that that it would be really important to include in the final report a reflection of not just areas that we landed on as recommendations, but areas of disagreement. That will come. This is not that, but I just wanted to give that reassurance that we have that in mind for when we're drafting the final report, so that you know that it's not just that we're reflecting everything here and calling it done. We will, when we draft the final report, work to make sure that that final report narrative is balanced.
So hopefully I don't know if there's any questions on this piece, but certainly we'll make sure that the links and resources are sent when things are updated and online. Okay, let's keep moving, Edith, and go to the next section. Yep, there it is.
So if you go to the next slide, we have to kind of etch a sketch our brains now. So we're not talking about the modeling results anymore for now. So this kind of maroon big box on the left, energy modeling results, essentially the complementary analysis begins with the results of the modeling. And as I was commenting a little bit earlier, the modeling doesn't take into account, it isn't able to take into account a lot of the really important costs and benefits that relate to how we kind of how we transition our energy sector, how we produce energy, how we use energy, and where we prioritize and how we prioritize. And so we've developed these additional tools to build on the modeling results and help better understand, in the case of the energy wallet, how the pathways in the scenarios affect household costs for different households across Oregon. We also have the ability to apply EPA's COBRA tool to better understand effects on air quality. And we also will be undertaking a whole separate modeling exercise to understand the employment effects of different scenarios and what they mean for jobs in Oregon. And then you'll see that geospatial mapping doesn't have an arrow, and that's because it kind of sits separately. So geospatial mapping essentially pulls together a lot of data sets to understand where different community level energy inequities lie, their relationship to socioeconomic disparities. And so we've worked with our environmental justice and equity group and also had a consultation on which kind of criteria, which indicators are priorities for that geospatial mapping, so that we can have some maps that help us think through kind of geographically what some of the outcomes of the energy wallet or the air quality modeling might mean, and that can then inform the policy discussions. So so these are the sort of the tools that we have that we're developing to help better understand and inform the policy discussions. And if we go to the next slide, what I want to do is just reflect back sort of what we heard, particularly on the energy wallet. So most of these slides will be focused on the energy wallet. Last time we all met in November, we were about to issue for public comment some draft recommended definitions of 5 representative households that we could use to undertake this energy wallet analysis. And so what I'm going to do is summarize what we heard and where we landed. So the here you can see some description of what we heard. So we received feedback on ensuring that specific groups were represented. So for example, we heard sort of a priority to differentiate between consumer-owned utility customers and investor-owned utility customers. We heard about being sure that tribes are represented. There's a suggestion to have a Willamette Valley single-family home as an important household to represent. Rural and harsh climates was another suggestion, or new multifamily housing. It was also clear, so we had this kind of broader set of ideas to draw on that builds on the initial recommended kind of list of suggested scopes for a representative household that we started with. And then we also received feedback going to energy burden here that made it really clear that energy burdened households need to be reflected in the analysis. And that was really important because it helped, it sort of helped us see the importance of making sure that we do that. Several commenters provided ideas on criteria to consider when balancing our kind of decision, but the process of landing on those 5 households. So some of those criteria were representing as many households as possible, reflecting, again, energy burdened households, helping to inform forward-looking housing solutions. And there were also comments, including in this group last time around, about considering different fuel use. Commenters also emphasized the importance of costs for electricity and for different fuels and opportunities for energy efficiency. And one of the comments we received was also to conduct something called a non-parametric ANOVA analysis, which I really had to ask our consultants what that meant and whether they could do it, but they confirmed, they just explained it and confirmed that that was something that they could do. And we did undertake that analysis. So I just want to talk about that for a moment. Essentially, and Patrick, I think that this was a comment from you actually. So essentially what our consultants did was to compare the potential groups that we had and then that others suggested, and compare them with each other to identify where there were important statistical differences and key indicators for each group. So whether there are statistical differences in things like household consumption of fuels, for heating, for electricity, for transportation, in terms of vehicle miles traveled, things like that. And the idea is really to test groups to understand whether they're different enough to yield statistically distinct results. You don't want to define 5 households that kind of look the same, to put it really broadly. So then we took the results of that analysis and combined it with feedback we received on priority groups to include, and we came up with a final list of 5 customer groups. If we go to the next slide, I have one more just methodological note I thought might be useful for you all to see. So this is a map essentially of the groups that we proposed and then a couple that people added. And this is a map from NEIA, the Northwest Energy Efficiency Alliance, and their residential building stock assessment. And it shows the geographic areas from which the samples were taken for each group. So this map represents Oregon, Washington, Idaho, and Montana. And I just wanted to point this out because I think it's helpful just to see like where the heck were where was this data pulled from? What geographically, like where these households that were, or these samples that were building these representative households on, where were those samples taken? And I also want to point out that when we did this analysis, we realized that for manufactured homes, the sample size in Oregon was just really small and really too small to feel comfortable with. But this turned out to be a pretty high priority category to include in the energy wallet analysis. So for manufactured homes, and really only for that category, we expanded the sample size and included NEIA's data from the region and not just from Oregon, so that we could have a more robust sampling of how energy is being used in manufactured homes and coming up with a profile. So if we go to the next slide, here's a list of kind of on the left what we started with, some household profiles that were added for consideration. And then we, unfortunately, we only have the budget for 5. So in the end, we ended up with the final list on the right. And I just wanted you to have this visual, but on the next slide, I'll elaborate on what this final list actually means. First, if you look to I want to start kind of with the right-hand side of the slides. You can see the main criteria that were used to differentiate these households. So the focus is really on household consumption of all fuels and associated costs. And I want to talk a little bit about how we did this, like where we got the information for these customer groupings. So as you just saw, we in those maps, we built on NEA's database of households, which accounts for building stock. So it accounts for kind of the type of building, the vintage, the level of efficiency, fuels used, to understand the levels of fuel consumption and electricity consumption in the different representative household categories. And then we integrated vehicle miles traveled from something called the HMT index. So that's the Housing and Transportation Affordability Index, which is developed by a group. It's a national data set developed by a group called the Center for Neighborhood Technology. And then we kind of pulled that data and you can see that these customer groups come from NEA's database. And so we have a really good database to draw on for this information for each of these customer groups. So the first category, homeowner, is meant to help inform an understanding of how energy costs will be affected for really this is the broadest category of homes in Oregon, or the one that covers the most homes in Oregon. And it's an owner occupied single family detached home in Oregon. The rural home is a single family detached home located in a rural region in Oregon. I'll say that we compared rural home against rural and harsh climate, and we didn't see enough of a deviation to separate these out into 2 distinct groups or to do both. So we included just rural home here. For high priority area homes, this is a single family detached home located within a high priority area county identified in Oregon's 10-year plan. So essentially, it represents high-risk populations that reflect a high level of energy burden, low incomes, older homes, and populations of people of color. And it includes both the kind of data set that it draws on includes both urban and rural homes. And these are all indicators that we saw prioritized in the comments that we received. We also got a lot of comments that manufactured homes would be a priority to include in the energy wallet analysis. And I just want to clarify here that when we say it assumes the cost of energy is 70% higher than the average cost in Oregon, that's per square foot. And that's to really reflect the lower energy efficiency of these homes in terms of the thermal envelope. And then low income renter multifamily homes are it's a home with a low income renter occupied multifamily home in Oregon, includes all multifamily building types. And these are mostly, when we look geographically at where these homes are, it mostly represents an urban, most of these households are in urban areas. And also from the feedback that we received, this was also a pretty high priority for folks. So these are the 5 customer groups that we landed on. There was a question in our last meeting about what fuel is assumed, particularly for like heating and hot water heating for these different households. For all of them, it ends up being either electricity or gas. The fuel that is used for the representative household for the energy wallet analysis is the one that's most common in that category of home. So for example, for homeowners, there's a little bit more gas use than electric use in owner-occupied single-family homes. And so that's the fuel used for heating for the energy wallet analysis in that category. And I just want to say that we're just setting this analysis up because we don't have the final modeling results. So this is something that won't be ready on the 31st. I wish it was, but the timeline isn't allowing for it. But it is really important to inform the working group discussions. And so we're working really hard with our consultants to have this ready as soon as possible so that we can have this analysis so that we can really understand a little bit more deeply what's coming out of the modeling and what it means and to have a better informed policy conversation.
Edith, do you want to pause before the air quality portion?
So.
Okay. So let's pause for any questions, comments. Jennifer, Jolly, jump in.
I was just curious about why you opted, like the manufactured homes are such a small segment that you had to pull from other states, but yet you didn't include any COUs. Can you explain the rationale?
Yeah, so they're a small segment. I'll say it's a very small sample size in NEA's analysis. The sample size in Oregon was really small. Manufactured homes account for, I'm fishing for the number because somebody just shared it with me this morning, 8% of Oregon homes. So it is a significant percentage of homes. But the point that I was making was about the statistical sample being too small. The way that we are planning to address the question about COU homes. So essentially, we heard that question, and we think that it's an important distinction to make. However, across COUs, there are urban, there are rural, there are different housing types. And so the customer groups themselves are really focused on the housing type and how much of which type of fuel is used, and then how that changes over time and what that means for cost. So the place where I think the distinction can best be made is once we start to process these groups, we're working out how we could differentiate somewhat the kind of starting point in terms of costs for electricity between COU and IOU territories.
Well, in terms of the starting point, I mean, they're a nonprofit versus a shareholder investor-owned utility is going to be a lot different starting point, even if the rates vary and the building types and so forth. So I mean, I guess, you know, I guess we're in a minority position in on that, but it's very disappointing.
Jennifer, I hear you. I don't know that I might not be explaining myself very clearly, and that might be part of the problem. I mean, essentially there isn't the distinction that we're making in defining the customer groups has to do really with the housing stock and the starting point in terms of how much, what energy people are using and what the energy sources are. You know, how much is electricity, how much is gas, what is it used for? And the whole idea of the energy wallet analysis is that over time, for example, if you go from an internal combustion engine car to an EV, your household energy bill is going to shift, right? So your electric bill will go up, but your gasoline bill will go down. And the idea is to show that difference. And so where the distinction can be made between the cost differences for electricity is really in that kind of that part of the analysis and not on the definition of the household itself. So right here, we're focusing just on the definition of the household itself. It's complicated to do that second part, which is why I don't have a clear answer on how we're going to do it. But we've spoken to our consultants about this, and we are working out how we could take into account the differences in terms of the costs that COU customers see for their electricity, given the structural differences and differences in terms of where customers are getting their power, where utilities are getting their power, and at what cost. That's something that we can't provide detail on right now because we're still working it out.
But am I hearing, Edith, a desire to tease that out as a secondary part of analysis?
Yeah.
I guess my only concern is that the wallet is only telling part of the story if you're defining it that narrowly. And so in the document or report, I hope that it does get teased out because it's only a very small part of the story, especially in Oregon and Washington, where there is a lot of public power.
Yeah. Thank you, Jennifer. And Laura, you had a comment in the chat that I think is aligned with what Jennifer was just asking. Did you want to add anything else?
I think Edith may have been answering my question as I was typing it in terms of what you're able to differentiate on the model output side. But yeah, it just seemed like I understood the rationale of, those homes don't look different, but their rate structure, it may be different. So that would be the piece where it's like that second bullet in the inputs to the energy wallet. might be
Yeah,
the opportunity.
the model output, so the model outputs will not be, the model won't be able to tell us what rates are. That's a separate conversation, right? But the model will give us an idea of kind of the overall cost of the transition. And it won't be by IOU versus COU territories. It's a statewide analysis that we're doing. But what we can do is understand kind of what the different starting point is for the different customer groups, and understand that, and take into account the kind of differences in rates to date, because those are significant. And then I hesitate to say more about how we're going to do it, because there are some really big methodological questions that we have, and so I don't want to misstate that piece. But I think it is important to differentiate here that here we're talking about the housing characteristics, and then we're talking about the analysis and what we actually do with the costs in the household energy wallet. So what we've done so far is to define the characteristics of the actual housing stock.
And then either just to clarify, and Scott, will come to you, just to clarify, the model hasn't began, like this will not be part of the presentation on January 31st, but still it's at a place where these type of decisions have still been made, right? So you're not changing what's here, right? It's just a timeline for when that modeling analysis can occur. Is that
That's right.
accurate?
So what we're saying is that this is where we've landed, and there is some work happening behind the scenes to set things up so that once we get the modeling results, we can develop these energy wallets. And so we're kind of in that process where this point about COU and IOU customers can be worked out. So, but we're like in that process right now. But what you're seeing here is something that's now been fixed. So the actual kind of characteristics of the households has been fixed.
But Jennifer, your points are made, and we'll make sure they're captured accurately in our conversation. And certainly, this will be an ongoing point of discussion that you can continue to raise. Scott?
Yeah, I would just add additional points to Jennifer's comments there. I would agree with her, and I would just say that, I think at the outset of this, we talked about, if you've got different parameters, different energy systems, bundled within the state of Oregon, even though we're gonna have a state energy plan, we've got to think, strategically about what are the different levers and different options for, those two systems that are kind of co-combined, if that makes sense. So, in other words, like, we've got grant programs right now that are specifically suited to, certain segments of utilities, if they fit a certain geographic profile, certain economic profile for their citizenry. So I think thinking along those lines, we're just being a little bit maybe more of a scalpel approach with our energy plan outcomes versus the writ large approach. I think that's kind of what we're looking for. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. And those are all really important points, and really important for us to keep in mind when we set up the policy working group discussions, because that's really, I think, where this differentiation and this conversation is going to need to happen. So I appreciate that comment.
Great, thank you. Any other pieces on this part? Otherwise, we'll move into the air quality analysis. Not seeing any more in the chat, no hands. Let's move to the next piece.
Okay. So here I just switching gears to another piece of complementary analysis. As I mentioned, we're going to be conducting some air quality modeling with the outputs from the model. There was no change in the definition of county clusters that we suggested for that analysis. As we mentioned in our last meeting, we suggested, and at this point, there's no change to that suggestion, to break out Oregon into clusters. So we've ended up with 10 regions for the air quality modeling so that we can get results for separate results for each of these regions. And this is something that that the EJ and equity group members recommended, and that our consultants also confirmed was possible. So we've landed, this is kind of where we started, and this is where we landed. And as for the energy wallet, the air quality modeling is being set up now, but results won't be available for this on the 31st either. It'll be a little bit later, but still working really hard to make sure that it's there in time to inform the working groups and the working group discussions. So if we, since there's no change on this one, I'm just going to fly up to the next one and touch briefly on geospatial mapping. So for the geospatial mapping, we started with a list of data points that we could consider pulling into maps, again, to help inform policy discussions. And we got a good amount of support for the proposed approach. The comments helped us understand what the priority indicators are for folks. So some of those that we saw prioritized were race, ethnicity, language, income level, poverty level, and education levels. We were also asked to add percentage of individuals receiving Medicaid benefits and percentage of individuals receiving Social Security disability income as additional indicators to include in the geospatial mapping. And also an indicator to help analyze wildfire-related air quality impacts. And it looks like we're also able to do that. So we also agreed to postpone a final selection of mapping variables until people have had a chance to comment on the modeling and on what they're seeing in the energy wallet and air quality outputs, which makes a lot of sense to us because it's kind of hard to know what would be most helpful to see on a map until you see what's most meaningful in the results. So we have defined, and you'll see in a second on the next slide, 15 maps, but there's flexibility to create more that we're leaving in there. The last suggestion that I wanted to mention that we received was to create an interactive map that folks could kind of click around on the Odo's website. That's something that's not in scope for this project, but we're exploring this at Odo. We have a dedicated GIS analyst who we've had now for a few months, and so we're looking into what we could do. But it's something that we have to look at on a slightly separate timeline, and we also need to take into account other mapping work that we're doing to see how we would integrate all of that. But it was a really good comment and something that we're talking about how we could do within Odo. If you go to the next slide, here are, and we'll share these slides with you after this meeting so that you have them, but here are the 15 maps we've come up with. I'm not expecting that you absorb all of this, where, like I said, I think there's flexibility to create more. And so I don't know that we're looking for comments right now on this list of 15. I'll say that this list of 15 reflects priorities that we heard from folks. If there's something you don't see here that you think is important, we'd be really happy to hear about it. I think the best timing to hear about it would be, I mean, you can always reach out to us. You could reach out to us now too, but we would hold that comment until we get into the policy discussions a little bit and until we see some of those other results on the energy wallet and on the air quality mapping to see which additional maps would provide the most useful information. So that's essentially it on updates. I don't know if there are any questions on any of the other complementary analysis updates that I just showed here.
Scott, I just saw your comment come through, but it sounds like you already said it out loud. Questions or comments on these last couple pieces around the mapping and populations? I am neither seeing chat nor hands raised on this piece. Okay, so we can move into kind of our closing, talk about next steps and the schedule coming up.
Yeah, thanks. So if we jump to the next slide, this shows the schedule of meetings for this group over the next several months. And these should already, I believe, Josh, jump in if I'm wrong, but I think that we've already sent out invitations for all of these meetings. Fred, your hand is up.
Yeah, no, this is the right time. Thanks, everybody. It's Fred Hewitt, Northwest Energy Coalition. Looking separately at the list of the subgroups, I'm wondering, I'm not quite clear on this, so maybe you could help me. Are you open to have, I guess, is the idea to rearrange the groups we had last year and in these new categories? And are you open to new entries into those groups? Basically my question.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Fred. So yeah, we are open. So if you have suggestions of somebody who you think would be a helpful contributor to the group, we're definitely open, and please let us know. We're following a similar process to last time around. So we have reduced down the number of groups to 5, of working groups to 5. The environmental justice and equity group has carried through. The others are new, but there's obviously overlap to last time around. And so there are a lot of the same people who will be in these groups, but we did send out separate kind of a new invitations for folks and conducted an exercise to try to make sure that we have a really good balance of perspectives in the room to inform a policy discussion, which is different from a kind of a technical discussion on model inputs and things, which is why we felt it was necessary to do this again. If you have an idea, Fred, or anybody else on this call of someone who you think would be great, and we haven't reached out to them, we're certainly open to your suggestions. Does that answer your questions?
Yeah, thanks. And I think your point about the shift in focus toward the ultimate recommendations that will go to the legislature is a good one, because I think that's pretty clearly what we're going to be looking at a lot more this year. The other question is, in terms of recommendations from us and other organizations about which groups we would like our people to be on, do you have a kind of soft deadline for that, or what process do you want to go through?
I would just say the sooner the better. We sent around, as part of the materials for today's meeting last week, we sent around a schedule for all of the working groups, and we've tried to be very as conscious as we could be about session happening, and we tried to kind of blank out the working group calendar for what we see as kind of the busiest window for session. But once those groups get going, it's going to be pretty intense. So I think if I would say by the end of next week, we'd really want to have nailed down as much as possible those groups. And really, we've tried to do it up until now so that we could send out the first round of information. And we've done a little bit of outreach already to folks who we've invited and who have confirmed. So, the sooner the better.
Right.
But just
Okay,
to give
good. So by the end of next week. And one final question, is the schedule completely firmly in place? There may be some interest perhaps in adding more meetings, one or more meetings in addition for some of the groups. I think I was not involved in the equity group over or last year, but I know there was a lot of concern about whether there was enough time in that particular area.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. For the equity group, we did incorporate more meetings, and we actually continued meeting kind of into the fall, and among other things, to inform this energy wallet analysis. I think there's a question for us of our capacity to do more meetings than what we have built in here. So I think if there was an interest, I think we're open to having the conversation, but there is a question about feasibility as well.
Right. So not a completely closed door, but I certainly recognize the difficulty, or the chore in managing all this, and of course I'm sure everybody is struggling with schedules,
Yeah.
so thanks.
Yeah, I mean, you can see on the slide, right? This is still a quick process happening at the same time as the legislative process, statewide. So, I appreciate the recommendation, flexibility, and the grace around Odo's capacity, kind of from meeting to meeting, and to manage the level of conversations that come with it. Thanks, Fred. But yeah, I mean, I think I heard you saying that by next Friday, Edith, is that reasonable?
Yeah, I think if after next Friday, I think we get so close to because it just becomes difficult for us to actually track any changes, because we need to get on with just setting things up for the working group. So
Okay.
yeah, by next Friday
Yeah,
would be great.
and one more thing. I know this is even a little bit more additional burden, but I would recommend, based on our experience in the committee process, the subgroup process last year, to get input right at the beginning of each of these new groups to, how to structure the discussion, given that there's going to be limited time.
That's awesome. Thank you, Fred. So we'll capture that as a recommendation, Odo team. Any other questions about kind of makeup, process, timeline, order of operations in terms of the schedule, or anything you want to add, Edith?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, well, I wanted to add a couple of things on this schedule, which is this. So this is just for our group, right? And then in between this, we'll be meeting with other agencies. We'll be carrying out these working group meetings. We also have a couple of public forums / listening sessions planned, one kind of earlier on in the process and one a bit later to hear from kind of anybody who might be interested, folks who maybe don't have the capacity to participate in a bunch of working groups, but want to be heard or want to learn more about the energy strategy. So we have a lot of engagement planned in this window. So a few just specific points I want to make. First is that just a reminder that February 20th meeting will be an opportunity to ask any kind of additional questions, or mainly to get clarification on the modeling results. We're not going to do a full presentation of the modeling results in that meeting, but Jeremy will be there. And I suspect that we'll want to recap some of the modeling results, but I guess the reason that I say that is that it would be really helpful and important for you all to either join on the 31st or listen to that recording if you can, so that for that February 20th meeting, you come sort of prepared with your observations rather than reacting in real time. I think it'll be a more productive meeting that way. And then the March and April meetings we just say policy because we'll be in the midst of all these conversations with the 5 policy groups and with the other kind of other engagements that I just mentioned that we'll have ongoing. And, I just wanted to pause for a minute and reflect back. In phase 1, we had a very compressed timeline. So this is the working groups will be meeting over kind of a 3-month period here. Last summer it was much less time. It was really compressed, and we heard you and others with commenting that was really difficult. So we've tried to provide more time here. It also means that we have more intermediate stops as an advisory group to report back on what we're hearing and to hear your questions and to bring questions to you. And I don't know what those questions will be, but I just wanted to just say that this group plays different roles at different points in the process, right? Like today was primarily a meeting to reflect back on and to report back and explain what changed and why, and what decisions we took and why we took them, and to answer your questions. As we get into the working groups, I think that we won't just be reporting back. We'll want to make sure that we're engaging with you meaningfully. And so if you have ideas based on the experience from last time around on what would be helpful to, maybe we can share materials with you that we're sharing with the working groups ahead of time. Or, just any ideas that you have on the role that you would like to play here, or what you might like to do differently than we did last time. We're open to those thoughts and those ideas, because we want to make sure that these stops that we make with you, the advisory group, once a month are really productive as we get into those policy discussions and have these meetings that are sort of in the middle of it all, and meant to sort of be an opportunity to both reflect back on what we're hearing, but also I imagine we'll bring what we've been doing up until now, which is to bring the questions where we're not hearing alignment to you, and to have a hard discussion about it, because this is a really good place to have those difficult discussions.
Thanks, Edith. I don't see any other questions, folks, on our schedule upcoming. Okay, well, let's move. Scott, jump in.
Sorry, I was just gonna say, one thing that's really helpful, is just the ability to sometimes, sub in somebody that, you know, is an informed and up to speed official example. You know, obviously Jennifer Jolly is here today for Tucker from ORACA, and I think it's just because we are all dealing with limited staffs and sometimes competing priorities. So I just want to thank folks for allowing people to sub in from time to time when they're read up on the issues, and I think that's really going to be an important quality going forward for continuity aspect, because we do, you know, try to share with each other and keep each other apprised, but it's a very lean set of organizations. Thanks. And I'm sure it goes for the other folks on these calls too.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Scott. And just, you know, I guess I'll just collectively ask, maybe on behalf of kind of the process, that if there are, that it's kind of advisory group members' obligation to kind of brief folks. Obviously, if it's just filling in because there's other competing priorities or capacity issues, or if it's a subject matter expertise or something like that, just please take some time to make sure folks are briefed coming into the space. So I appreciate you naming that, Scott. We're going to work the best to balance and make sure we just have the voices in the room so we get all the perspectives. So appreciate you naming it. Okay. Well, let's
Nick?
talk. Oh, Edith, sorry.
Oh, but I was just gonna say, there's one more slide here with timeline that I just wanted to show because it elaborates. It's not the advisory group meeting schedule, but just kind of what's coming up.
Yep.
So one more plug for the 31st, and also a note that this info session starts at 10, but there's some time to sort of mingle and chat starting at 9:30. So also come early so we can have a chat beforehand. Then we have the first policy working group meeting. It's going to be on February 12th. February 18th will be that info session I was mentioning. Or sorry, forget what I just said. February 18th will be that's when we plan to present the complementary analysis. It's possible that date might shift because the modeling results are coming in later than we expected, but for now, I would say that's a placeholder. And then February 19th to April 14th is the window where we'll be having these policy working group meetings. And just a reminder, what will come out of that whole process will be recommended or draft policy recommendations for that we'll bring to you. And then we'll put out for public written comment. And then in June, approximately, we plan to have those draft policy recommendations for comment. And then I believe that the jobs results they're gonna come out a little bit later. So because that's a whole separate modeling exercise that has to happen. So the jobs results will stay tuned on those because we don't quite have those on the calendar yet. It's gonna be an exciting year. Thanks everybody for the time. It's great to see you all in the year.
Awesome. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Jen, did you say something?
Say goodbye.
Oh, we actually, yes, that's it. So if we could go to the last slide for thank yous, right?
I think so. Okay, good. I didn't.
Oh, we're not doing, is there public comment?
Well, this is just
Yes, for the people. I was like, wait a second, we don't have public comment at these meetings, but the portal is open and live. I just had a little mini heart attack. So you know, that is ongoing, and we will see you soon. Here's 14 minutes back in your life. Appreciate everybody. Much love. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.